Well, hi, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Joel Hunter here. Let me get my mic on as we get started on today's topic, which is going to be the normative theory of ethical egoism. And so we are in Russ Schaefer-Landau's text, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Yours might look different if you have the 4th edition. I'm using the 3rd, but there is essentially little difference in the content of what we're going to talk about today between the 3rd and the 4th. So if you're using the 4th, you're good to go. So we're talking then now in about a normative theory. In other words, theory about what is right and wrong conduct or right and wrong behavior, about what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. In other words, norms or standards for our behavior. That's where normative theory comes from. And so what we're going to do is move over into our slides and discuss some of the things that I need you to know from Chapter 8. So first of all, of course, we have to define ethical egoism. And as a normative theory, now we're talking again about what is right or what one ought to do. So actions are morally right just because they best promote one's self-interest. And so you need to have this idea linked to right action is right because what makes it right is that it promotes your self-interest. Now, if you saw the video on Chapter 7 or psychological egoism, then you know that that's one possible source of support for ethical egoism. But you can be an ethical egoist without being a psychological egoist. Remember, psychological egoism is a descriptive theory about human motivation. It tells how we act the way we do, or why we act the way we do on the basis of motivation, and that we're always self-seeking, in other words, and that the implication of that is that there's no such thing as altruism. Well, in ethical egoism, now we want to know what to do. How ought we to behave? And so the ethical egoist might be a psychological egoist, but it isn't necessary. So we're going to be talking now about the main challenge for ethical egoism. And if you, in your text, your author, I'll spit it out eventually, your author gives this as the argument of the paradigm case, or argument from the paradigm case, or paradigmatic case. And so here's how the argument works. If an ethical theory requires killing, raping, or stealing just because such actions promote self-interest, then that theory cannot be true. So that's a statement of a basic moral intuition, that if we're going to have an ethical theory that seems plausible, then it doesn't seem like these kinds of actions, killing, raping, stealing, would be advised, or that they would be right in any circumstance. And so the ethical egoist, however, rejects this premise because they do not allow that any particular action is forbidden if it promotes self-interest. Okay, so the first premise then of this argument, the challenge to the ethical egoist, is to overcome this sort of basic intuition about moral intuition about what we expect from our ethical theories, that they would not require us to do things like kill, rape, or steal. Okay, so the second premise then is simply asserting the first half of the first premise, which is the antecedent of that if-then statement. So it says ethical egoism sometimes requires such things as killing, raping, or stealing, just because they sometimes do promote some self-interest. And so it follows then that the consequent is true, that ethical egoism cannot be true. Okay, so that is the challenge for the ethical egoist, is that they are up against a very commonly shared intuition. Now, that doesn't mean that the theory is false just because it's unpopular or that it has a particularly difficult challenge to overcome, but it just needs to be able to confront that challenge and give a plausible argument on its behalf. Okay, So let's look at then a series of arguments, and your author calls these two popular arguments for ethical egoism, and what he's doing there is signaling to you that these would be arguments that you would hear sort of in popular discourse, that you would hear, say, in the public sphere somewhere, maybe as advanced in social media, or implied by certain claims about what's right and wrong that you might hear just discussed popularly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these two popular arguments, and your author does basically a takedown of these arguments by showing problems with one or more of the premises. And then we'll move into what he considers to be a better or the best argument for ethical egoism. And so we'll end with that. But for now, let's look at these popular arguments. So the first one is called the Selfreliance Argument, and it states that if everyone were to mind his own business and tend only to his own needs, then everyone would be better off. And so the second premise then states a moral principle. We ought to do what will make everyone better off. And then it follows, putting 1 and 2 together, that if those are both true, then we ought to mind our own business and tend only to our own needs. Now, what we have here is that the egoism requires us, it seems, to do things that are highly immoral, and it forbids us from doing some things that are clearly morally good. Okay? So what we need to do is figure out if a particular action is required, morally forbidden, or morally permitted. In other words, it's optional, it's allowable, it's permissible, but maybe not required. Okay, so remember, we're coming back to this the key concept here of self-interest, of promoting self-interest. That's what the ethical egoist has to show. And so one way of expressing this is that we are minding our own business, we are tending to our own needs. Now, the first premise seems to be pretty clearly false. So if you think of, and I use this example frequently in the psychological egoism chapter in that video, if you think of the case of the sort of easy rescue, okay, an easy rescue means where two individuals, one individual is in need of being rescued, needs help. Maybe their life is at stake or is threatened. And the other party has the opportunity as well as the ability to help that individual in what they need at very little to no cost to themselves. Okay? So, an example, suppose I know CPR. And suppose you are suffering from a heart attack and you're lying on the sidewalk. There's no one else around. And I come along and I happen to be there. So the opportunity is there for me to help you. I know CPR. I don't have any other kind of pressing engagement. So there is nothing to prevent me from being able to offer you assistance in that situation. Okay. But if that's the case, look at premise 1. If everyone were to mind his own business and tend only to his own needs, then everyone would be better off. Now, in the case of the easy rescue that I just described, that's obviously false. How is it making you better off if I am minding my own business and just going on my merry way, tending to my own needs, while you are there, near death and in need of immediate medical assistance that I am able and knowledgeable enough to provide? That seems clearly false, right? Okay, so then you have the idea that this idea of minding our own business, tending only to our own needs, this is often cast in terms of self-reliance. Well, of course, there are many occasions, or maybe even most occasions, where it is a good thing to be self-reliant, to not require the help of others. But I just gave you an example, the easy rescue, where if I am in need of assistance from someone else, what is the moral requirement then on that other person. So it seems that there are times when self-reliance either is not available to me, or I cannot be self-reliant, or that that we expect others to not be self-reliant in those particular cases if we're looking out for one another. So it's not always a case of sort of poking into other people's business when we're talking about tending to our own needs. But if that is the only thing that's going to make everyone better off, that seems obviously false. Okay, so the second premise, we can do something that promotes others' well-being. But notice that the ethical egoist does not agree with this. Okay, the ethical egoist does not think that improving others' well-being is at all a consideration for what makes an action right or wrong. Instead, it is about maximizing your own personal benefit. So the ethical egoist would reject premise 2. And so, although you will hear this as an argument advanced for ethical egoism, it actually contradicts the basic definition and principle of ethical egoism. That is, we should only do that which promotes our own self-interest. So there are problems with both premise 1 and premise 2. And so that means that the conclusion is, therefore, implausible. Okay, the second argument that you will commonly hear in support of ethical egoism is what your author calls the Libertarian Argument. And so here, we bring in this concept of our moral duties. And so remember now, just to reset, what is our moral duty in ethical egoism? It is to promote our own self-interest. Okay, the Libertarian Argument, however, suggests that we have that our moral duties have two sources. One is consent, and second is reparation. Okay, so in, again, the case of the easy rescue, okay, think of that. Where does my moral duty to provide assistance, CPR, to the person who needs it, where does that come from? Well, it doesn't come from consent in this particular case, right? I was morally required to help you, even if I didn't agree to do it. And then the question of reparation, well, I did no harm to you. I mean, I didn't provoke the heart attack, so I'm not fixing something. I'm not redressing some wrong that I've done. So the moral duty to render assistance in the easy rescue scenario does not come from consent and reparation. And so it would not follow that, okay, so sorry, let me back up and come back to the argument. So according to the Libertarian Argument, with those two moral sources, if I have not consented to help someone or owe him no reparation for harm, then I'm not obligated to help him. Okay, so that would only follow if, in fact, those are only the two sources of our moral duties. But I am obligated to help in the case of the easy rescue, or so it seems on the face of it, and sort of basic moral intuitions. And anything would say that I'm not obligated to help in that situation, the easy rescue situation, would be morally suspect, that kind of theory. And so the Libertarian Argument fails because premise number 1 is more than likely false. Seems obviously false. Okay, so so there's two reasons that it fails. One is it seems obviously false just from a non-ethical egoist position. I can imagine that I have moral duties, and I'm aware, not just imagine, I'm aware of moral duties that I have, but they come from a different source. So we can talk about what that source will be, and we will in other ethical theories that we'll discuss, especially in Kant. But the ethical egoist also rejects the first premise because it only has, for the ethical egoist, there's only one source of our moral duty, and that is self-interest. What is promoting my own good, my own self-interest. Okay, so those are the two bad arguments for ethical egoism, but nevertheless popular. You will hear those bandied about. So here your argument that the author suggests is the best argument for ethical egoism is here. Okay? So we are talking then about the connection between a moral requirement to do something and then it making us better off. In other words, promoting our self-interest. So that's the connection that has to be made. And so what is going to connect that here is having a good reason to do the thing that you're morally required to do. Okay? So this answers the question, why be moral? And that is discussed as a way of explaining the justification for these premises. So if you're morally required to do something, then you have good reason to do it. All right, so we'll look at that in a moment. If there is good reason for you to do something, then doing it must make you better off. We'll look at the plausibility of that also in a moment. So it follows that, and this is valid. This is a valid argument, unlike the others that we saw. If you are morally required to do something, then doing it must make you better off. Okay, so the conclusion follows from the premises. Now the question is, are the premises in fact true? Okay, so the two premises are widely accepted as true. That's why it seems highly plausible just on the face of it. So let's look at the first premise. Let me just move forward here real quick. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna conclude with the problems once we get through this analysis of the best argument. Okay, so if I'm duty bound to do something, do I have a good reason to follow through with it? But what about there are reasons that go against me doing my duty? Maybe keeping a promise, for example. So if I'm morally required to keep my promises, then I have good reasons to do it, or tell the truth. Okay? Let's grant that. Now look at the second premise. It's hard to doubt that there are compelling reasons to protect your own interests, right? If some action is going to end up in resulting in only loss and no gain for me, reason is there for me to do it. It seems irrational for me to sacrifice my own interests without some sort of compensation for that, right? So, yeah, I could give up my life for a stranger. Think back to the example of Ross McGinnis in Chapter 7. Yeah, I mean, I could be a hero and give up my life for a stranger or even for a friend. And then, you know, all of my future happiness would be wiped out. But it seems that reason can't compel me, or it doesn't suggest that that kind of sacrifice is required. Okay. Let's look again then at the first premise. The first premise, you know, we can take that as plausible. I think that seems of the two premises the most plausible. But then if we look at the second premise, we can think of reasons that this premise seems less plausible. So if you look at an action that makes you better off, then there's a good reason for you to do it. So self-interest always seems to be a good reason for doing something. Now, notice that's saying that's a sufficient reason, not a necessary reason, though. Okay? So if an action makes you better off, then there's a good reason for you to do it. Okay, that's saying that there's that self-interest, promoting your welfare, is a sufficient reason for doing the action. But it doesn't say it's necessary. So that seems to be a good claim, but is it plausible? Well, your author says that this is probably a rock-bottom assumption, that if you deny it, then it isn't clear what you would use to support it. It's, in other words, you ultimately make a decision about the plausibility of this claim. And it could be that it's one of those starting claims like we saw in the introduction. Remember the list of 17, I think it was 17 or 19 sort of moral starting points. Well, maybe claim A, if an action makes you better off, then there's a good reason for you to do it. Maybe that's one of those moral starting points. And so that is a possibility. It might be more basic than any other claim that we might cite to defend it. But now look at an alternative view here, or not an alternative, but a reverse of this. So let's flip that relationship and say, if there's a good reason for you to do an action, then it must make you better off. Now there, we are saying that the connection between it making you better off is a necessary one for the good reason to do the action. If there's a good reason for you to do an action, then doing it must make you better off. Okay, so now that seems that there are tons of counter examples to it. And again, go to the easy rescue. Let's say, I witness an accident real time, okay, and I have a cell phone, so I can dial 911. Now, consider that for a second. If there's a good reason for you to do an action, then it must make you better off. Now, do I have a good reason to use my cell phone and call 911 as maybe the very first person who witnessed a horrible accident? Yeah, I have a good reason. What is that good reason? Well, a basic moral intuition, like I ought to help someone, especially if it's of no cost to me. There's no other moral considerations here. So we grant then that there's a good reason for me to do that action, then doing it must make me better off. Well, how does that follow? It's pretty clear how it would help the person who suffered the accident if I did the action of using my cell phone to call 911 to help, bring assistance to them. But how does that make me better off? It doesn't seem to make me better off at all. Okay, well, enter the psychological egoist, right, who's going to give you some story about maybe, this will help me not feel guilty for not doing something. Well, we've already addressed that. If you haven't reviewed psychological egoism in Chapter 7, you can have a look at that video, and I'll stick a link to it in the comments so that you can see what the problems are with that story about guilt, and that really this would be a case of self-interest or promoting self-interest, or that it's making me better off if I pick up the phone and dial 911. The other example in your text is that, well, suppose I'm walking along with you and, I see that you're about to, and you're looking at me, talking to me, and I see that you're about to run into a ladder with a window washer, and there's this big heavy load up there, and that I see, right away that, oh wow, that heavy thing could fall from a great distance and really hurt you, maybe even kill you. So it seems like that I have a good reason to warn you that, hey, you're about to bump into the ladder, right? Is that making me better off? No, that's making you better off. That's helping you. So, premise 2 in this argument seems quite questionable. We can think of lots of counterexamples to it. So, what the ethical egoist has to do is then they have to say that they have to come up with some account that it is promoting my self-interest in those particular cases, that is the good reason for doing it. Why is it the only good reason for doing it, though? And it seems like, at the very least, that it is also the good reason is that it benefits you, promotes your welfare. Okay, so that's what the ethical egoist then has to respond with. And it seems that if there isn't a good response to that problem with premise 2, then premise 2 is false, and so the argument would be unsound. Okay, so we have then, to conclude this section, we're going to talk about the 3 problems for ethical egoism. And these are pretty serious problems. And these are listed for you in subsections in your text, so do have a look at these. So as we started off with this idea, the big problem for ethical egoism is stated in that first premise, and it was that sometimes it's going to require us to violate core moral beliefs. So things like it is always wrong to rape, murder, torture. Well, egoism may sometimes require us to do those things whenever these are in our self-interest. So that, you can develop cases of examples of where the ethical egoist would make that argument, as implausible as it might sound. Maybe something like the ticking time bomb example, where you have someone who is suspected to have planted a bomb and it's about to go off and hurt a lot of people. And would the ethical egoist then, I should say that it's something that's going to harm you. I shouldn't put it off on others, right? But let's say that there's, okay, so there's a movie called Escape from New York, and the main character is injected with this thing that if he does not perform this task that's required of him in an allotted amount of time, it's going to go off. It's going to be like this little mini explosion. He'll die. Clearly, it's in his self-interest then to do whatever is required of him. And what might be required in such a case would be things like that would violate your core moral beliefs, okay, in order to preserve your self-interest. I only offer that as an example to show that, yeah, an ethical egoist account then is fairly simple to make for that, even though there still would be obviously ethical problems with that. Okay, so anyway, that's the first one, that it violates our core moral beliefs. Second, egoism cannot allow for the existence of moral rights. And so when we talk about rights of our own rights or rights of others, basic things like to be free from physical attack. So if it's wrong for anyone else to beat me up to a pulp, then even if it helps that person, somehow promotes their self-interest to beat me to a pulp, we would still say that it's wrong because it violates my right to be free from that kind of attack, right? So just flip that around to another person. Again, it seems like we have these other directed rights, other regarding rights and duties that, regardless of whatever self-interest it might be, in my case, to violate one of your rights, that any theory which suggests that the harm is required or justified because it promotes my own self-interest, that's a strike against such a theory. And so egoism does seem then to deny that moral rights have any currency at all, that they even exist. So that would be a problem. And third is that, and it's related there, is that it seems that egoism makes my interests all important. And again, I'll go back to the example of the easy rescue case, right? And it seems like an arbitrary selectivity of interests that, well, wait a minute, what is the justification for the absolute bias in favor of my own interests over anyone else's? All right? So, do others actually have moral claims that have to be honored? If they do, then ethical egoism is going to have a problem there. It's not going to be able to handle that. So then, at the very least, what the ethical egoist would have to do is to overcome this issue of it being an arbitrary rule that my own self-interest has to be promoted, even at the expense of others' self-interest. So it can't just be arbitrary. There should be a reason for that. And the problem is ethical egoism typically does not give that reason. Alrighty then. So there's chapter 8, ethical egoism. And those are the topics that you need to know. You need to know those arguments, the two popular arguments. Starting with the argument that the ethical egoist has to overcome the main obstacle, and then the two popular arguments often heard, and then the best argument for ethical egoism. Have a look at the discussion questions at the end of the chapter. Those are very helpful. And then I will see you next time for our next normative theory.